My mother smiled the whole time she handed my brother the keys to a fully renovated condo in downtown Toronto, and then she slid a manila envelope across the table to me, the kind that had been sitting in a basement somewhere collecting mildew. Inside was the deed to 40 acres of frozen half-collapsed Christmas tree farm out past Barrie, the kind of place you only find by accident when your GPS gives up. She leaned in so the rest of my aunt's retirement party couldn't hear her and told me I had 8 days to pay off $11,000 in back property taxes, or the farm would go to my brother instead along with everything else. She wanted to see me cry. My sister-in-law was already smirking into her wineglass, waiting for the show. I picked up my fork and kept eating my cake. What my mother didn't know was that her little punishment was sitting on something worth more than that condo ever would be, and the gift she'd just handed my brother was about to bury him. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened, but I'll tell you anyway. I'm Maren, I'm 31, and before I get into this, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Hit subscribe if you've ever had a parent who made you feel like a guest in your own family. I grew up in Oakville, Ontario, where my mother, Diane, ran our household like a country club she was personally responsible for the reputation of. Appearances were everything to her: the right coat in winter, the right school fundraiser, the right things said at dinner parties. That night was my Aunt Carol's 60th birthday at a steakhouse on Lakeshore, white tablecloths, a server who knew my mother by name. We were supposed to be celebrating Carol, but really, my mother had turned it into the unofficial reading of my late father's estate 2 years after he passed, because she liked an audience for these things. My brother Dean sat across from me in a blazer he definitely didn't pay for himself, turning his glass of red like he'd seen someone do it in a movie. At 34, Dean was the undisputed favorite, had been since we were kids, and he'd spent the last decade telling people he worked in private investment while actually working in his father-in-law's car dealership, doing something with financing paperwork nobody ever asked him to explain in detail. Next to him was his wife, Holly, 29, blonde, the kind of woman who said "I just think" before every cutting thing she said about me. She loved reminding me gently, sweetly, that she and Dean were the ones building a real future. My mother tapped her spoon against her water glass, the universal signal that she was about to make something about herself. She pulled a leather folder out of her purse. She'd clearly had this planned before we even sat down, and handed Dean a thick cream-colored envelope with a bow on it like it was Christmas morning. She announced, loud enough for the table next to us to hear, that Dean was receiving the downtown condo, 2 bedrooms, parking included, walking distance to his office. She said a man building his career needed to look the part. Dean kissed her cheek like he'd earned it. Holly actually clapped. Then my mother turned to me, and her whole face changed. The warmth just drained out of it, replaced with that look she'd been giving me my entire life. The one that said I was a disappointment she'd long since stopped being surprised by. She slid the stained envelope across the table without even looking at me properly. She said it was time I learned the value of hard work, since apparently going to school for accounting and actually holding down a steady job for 9 years hadn't taught me that already. Inside the envelope was the deed to my late father's old Christmas tree farm, the one he'd bought as a retirement project and never finished, the one that had been sitting empty and rotting since he died. She said the back taxes were due in 8 days, $11,000, and if I couldn't manage it, the farm would be folded into Dean's portion instead, along with my share of Dad's life insurance payout, the one thing I actually thought I could count on. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what she expected. It wasn't shame. It was something closer to relief, because for the first time in a long time, I understood exactly where I stood with her, in writing, with a deadline. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I said thank you, folded the envelope into my purse, and asked the server for the dessert menu. My mother looked almost disappointed that I hadn't given her the reaction she'd been planning for. Holly leaned over to Dean and whispered something that made them both laugh quietly into their napkins. I let them have it. I'd spent my whole life letting my mother believe she had the upper hand, mostly because fighting her had never gotten me anywhere except more excluded. What none of them knew was that I'd been quietly doing my own research for almost a year already, ever since my father's lawyer had mentioned something in passing at the will reading that nobody else seemed to register. My father hadn't just bought that farm to retire on. He'd bought it because of what was underneath it. I'd grown up tagging along behind him on weekends while he walked that property with a notepad talking about soil and drainage and something he called the mineral rights situation, which 13-year-old me had zero interest in. But I remembered enough of it that 2 years after his funeral, sitting alone in my apartment going through his old files because nobody else wanted them, I found a folder labeled in his handwriting, Maple Ridge Aggregate Survey. Inside was a decade-old geological assessment showing the land sat on a significant gravel and limestone deposit, the kind quarry companies in southern Ontario pay real money for, especially with how much construction had exploded north of the city in the years since. He'd never told my mother. Knowing their marriage, I understood exactly why. So when she handed me that envelope at the steakhouse with that smug little smile, she wasn't punishing me. She was handing me the one thing my father had actually left worth fighting for, and she had no idea. I paid the $11,000 in back taxes out of my own savings within 4 days, working with a property lawyer my father's old lawyer had recommended, a careful man named Mr. Okafor who didn't ask a lot of questions and didn't waste my time. I had the title fully cleared and registered solely in my name before the deadline even arrived. I didn't tell my mother. I let her assume I'd scrambled and failed because the silence worked in my favor. For the next 8 months, I lived something close to a double life. On weekends, I drove the 90 minutes up to Barrie, walking the property in rubber boots, meeting with 2 different aggregate companies who'd heard through the grapevine that the old Maple Ridge lot might finally be available. I learned more about gravel pricing per ton and provincial extraction permits than I ever thought I'd need to know. I kept my job at the accounting firm in Mississauga the whole time, told nobody at work or in my family what I was doing, and let my mother continue treating me like the disappointing daughter who'd inherited a worthless lot of dead pine trees. She brought it up exactly twice that whole year, both times at family dinners, both times with that same little laugh. Once she asked if I'd managed to sell off the junk trees for scrap, and I told her I was still figuring things out, which was technically true. The second time, Holly asked if I'd thought about just letting the bank take it, since clearly I wasn't doing anything with it anyway. I smiled and changed the subject to her upcoming baby shower. Meanwhile, Dean's situation was unraveling in ways nobody at that dinner table had any idea about yet. I found out later, piece by piece, mostly from my cousin who still worked summers at the dealership, that Dean hadn't actually been doing financing paperwork, so much as quietly co-signing and structuring loans for his father-in-law's used car lot, in ways that skirted federal lending regulations, the kind of thing that flies under the radar until it doesn't. He'd used the new condo as collateral for a line of credit to cover a shortfall nobody was supposed to notice. And he'd done it by forging my mother's signature as a co-guarantor on the paperwork, since she'd technically still held a small lien on the property from helping with the down payment. He thought it would buy him time. He didn't think anyone would actually check the signature against a notarized copy on file, because in his mind he was untouchable, the golden child who'd never had to clean up after himself in his life. I sealed the deal with the gravel company in late September. They offered a long-term extraction lease, not a sale, which Mr. Okafor strongly recommended I take, since it meant steady annual income instead of one lump payout I'd probably mismanage out of sheer inexperience. The numbers were almost embarrassing to say out loud. $210,000 a year for the first decade, adjusted for the volume actually extracted, with the land reverting fully back to me, restored at the end of the lease. I didn't tell my family right away. I wanted one more dinner first. It happened to be Thanksgiving, hosted at my mother's house this time, the kind of dinner where she likes to go around the table and have everyone share what they're grateful for this year. Which is really just an excuse for her to fish for compliments about herself. Dean went first and talked about his career momentum. Holly talked about the baby on the way. When it got to me, I said I was grateful for stability and for finally understanding the value of something other people had written off. My mother laughed, the same laugh from the steakhouse, and asked if that meant I'd finally sold off the tree farm to some hobby farmer for pocket change. I told her, actually, I'd signed a 10-year lease with Greer Aggregate that would pay out over $2 million across the term, and that the land was currently being assessed by a second company for a possible solar lease on top of it, since it turned out the south-facing slope was useful for more than just dying pine trees. The table went completely silent. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Dean actually laughed first. That nervous laugh people do when they think something's a joke and they're waiting for the room to confirm it. Nobody confirmed it, I just kept eating my turkey. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, two officers from the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center showed up at Dean's office with a representative from the lending institution. Because the forged signature on his line of credit application had finally been flagged during a routine audit triggered, ironically, by an unrelated investigation into his father-in-law's dealership. My mother found out when Dean called her in a panic from the parking lot, asking her to confirm to the bank that she had signed that paperwork, because if she didn't, the fraud was entirely his. She didn't lie for him. I'll give her that much. She told the truth, because the alternative was implicating herself in a federal fraud case, and self-preservation has always one thing my mother's reliable about. Dean lost the condo within the month, the bank seized it as part of the settlement, and he's currently working through a repayment plan that, according to my cousin, will take him most of the next decade to clear, on top of the legal fees. Holly moved back in with her own parents while she figures out what's next, baby and all. My mother called me in December, the first time she'd called me first in longer than I could remember. She didn't apologize, not really, not in so many words. She talked around it the way she always does, said something about how she'd never expected the farm to turn out the way it did, which was as close to an admission as I was ever going to get. I let her talk. I didn't need anything from her anymore, and that, more than the money, was the part that actually felt like winning. I still drive up to Barrie most weekends, not for the gravel pit, which mostly runs itself now under a property manager I trust, but because I planted a small section of new trees on the part of the land the extraction company isn't touching, just for myself. Nobody's punishment, nobody's consolation prize, just mine. The air up there in October smells like cold pine and turned earth, and for the first time in my life when I stand on that land, I don't feel like I'm standing on something my mother gave me out of spite. I feel like I'm standing on the one thing she ever actually gave me that was real, even if she never meant it that way. And I've learned that the inheritance that matters most isn't always the one with the nicest bow on it.